Hi. So, first of all, it's really an honor to be here. It's really fantastic to see so many colleagues in the audience that I've worked with as well. And to some of you, I'm sorry for some of the things that I'll say next, but not so sorry that I won't say them. As a technologist in particular, I find myself often in a tech ghetto, and so I kind of expect that everyone here will expect me to talk about technology, but instead I want to talk about the biggest threat to investigative journalists, and that is other investigative journalists. And if that sounds a little bit ridiculous, I'd like to tell you a story, and the story is pretty simple. Most of my story are personal anecdotes that I've experienced in the last 3 to 10 years working as a journalist independently, publishing on the internet, but also publishing with Der Spiegel, working with ProPublica or other agencies in different capacities. And so I come from a background of working with WikiLeaks to these organizations, and currently WikiLeaks is in, I don't know, the 6th or 7th year of being investigated by the US government for espionage and terrorism. So there's an important context there, which is when we talk about journalism, there's a big tent. And that big tent, when you're inside of it, you have the political support, or if you will, the privilege. Most of the white male journalists in the room will, of course, know what I'm talking about when I speak of privilege, and this is a part of that privilege. And so what I would say, in particular, is that I'd like to address a few realities about that. So one of them is literacy, which is to say most of the people that are in this room, which I would say I've worked with, they understand to some extent technology. But you've heard it here a little bit already, where people sort of talk about the tech guys and they bring up the tech guys. And there's an interesting thing there, which is actually there's an issue of literacy. We don't need to talk about tech activism just the same we don't need to talk about, for example, grammar activism or fact-check activism. This is a fundamental core component of modern journalism, being able to use a computer, understanding operational security. And what happens is that when people don't understand that, instead of having a little bit of humility, of which I have plenty, I'm sure you can see, they will absolutely do everything that they possibly can in order to discredit and to disqualify other journalists. And you actually see this happening all the time. That is to say, if you know how to use a computer, you're instantly a nerd, and the nerd is instantly out. And this is done under the mask of so-called objectivity. And to that I say, you are rarely, if ever, fucking objective. Your politics are in everything that you write. And so the question is, where are the disclosures and where is the data? So when I speak of literacy here, I don't only mean, of course, about fact-checking or about understanding how systems work, but also literacy and understanding what is and is not political. So for example, when we consider that capitalism itself pits us against each other, are we questioning that? Do we consider that the competitive models in journalism actually cause us to push people outside of the tents? Isn't it the case that when we negotiate about our contracts, isn't it the case when we think about money, that in fact is at the core causing us to betray each other and in fact to betray the public? I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the answer to that for me personally means that I have almost every single time I've worked on stories, I've taken, I would say, very small amounts of money. I've tried not to make my primary living from working as an independent journalist because, in fact, I find that it compromises me. It means that I'm tied to one editorial room, I'm tied to one political viewpoint, and usually those viewpoints are hidden away. They're hidden away where it's supposedly objective. But I tell you what, The Guardian, absolutely the shittiest publication in the English language, is shitty not for what they publish, but shitty for what they refuse to publish and pretend that it is a non-political discussion and decision. And so I want to tell you a little bit about why they're shitty and give you some sourcing, which you can then, if you'd like, investigate. I've not talked about most of these things in public, but I think it's important that after all of these great journalists have built up a tree of journalism, that we can put some fuel on the tree and then light the motherfucker on fire. So first I think we should, I guess I should start by saying it's not just The Guardian. I've experienced this a lot. Some of you have written things in papers, for example, where you call me or Julian Assange or Sarah Harrison internet activists. To you that have done that, I think that you do not understand potentially what you do, and in that case, I have some forgiveness for you. But for those of you that do, I understand that you think me your political enemy, and I take that up quite seriously, and I will win. So, with that in mind, I don't call you a grammar activist, but I would say that it is important that if we have disclosure activists in the audience, I think it's important to consider, for example, that when we have bylines together in papers, and later you call me an internet activist, it's important to remember that you should probably have disclosed in your article where you called me an internet activist that actually we were co-authors on, for example, the equivalent of the German Pulitzer Prize or something similar to that. To call me an internet activist is to consciously put me outside of the political tent of privilege and to say, go ahead. Instead of being under journalism law, you are under terrorism law. And of course, it's of course important to name names, and so thank you to the sponsor, Der Spiegel, keine Angst vor der Wahrheit. I think it's important to say, Michael Zonheimer, that for me, when you call me an internet activist, it breaks my heart because we have worked together. But more importantly, it breaks my heart because you put me under threat of going to prison for the rest of my fucking life. One of my favorite journalists in Germany, his name is Thilo Jung. He's a wonderful journalist. He has a very funny comedy show. And he says, alle Journalisten sind Aktivisten für die Wahrheit. All journalists are activists for the truth. And so let us address this concept of activism, and it works like this. Activism is used as a pejorative term in order to suggest that participation in a democratic society is somehow outside of the normal behavior. Fuck that. That is wrong. The purpose of journalism is not only to be engaged, but to engage others in that process. That is the purpose. It is to spread the truth. It is to bring facts. It is to put forward information. So, let us speak of the crimes now of The Guardian, who are by far much worse than anyone else in this realm, in my experience. First, what we will start with is David Lee and Alan Rusbridger. Why will we start with them? Well, first with David Lee, because he is an incompetent, illiterate, absolutely despicable human being with how he has treated Julian Assange. He has lied about facts about Julian Assange, suggesting, for example, that Julian suggested that informants deserved it, when in fact no such thing was said, as John, being at that lunch, can attest to that. He has, for example, released encrypted files, not understanding the difference between encryption and authentication, and done so in a way that actually published information that previously had even been withheld by WikiLeaks, and then blaming WikiLeaks for that. This is an absolutely atrocious problem, but what is worse than that is that when confronted with it, he continued to take his ignorance with him all the way out the door at The Guardian instead of correcting his mistake and owning his mistake. And for that, I really hope that we never forget that. We should never forget David Lee's legacy is to have published things and to have done so because he did not even understand what they were doing, and then to put Julian Assange under a bus so that that bus could run him over instead. So let us call that what it is. It is a political act of betrayal of Julian Assange. In the early days of the Snowden affair, I worked with Glenn Greenwald and with Laura Poitras and with many others, many in this room. Two of the great journalists that I worked with, Marcel Rosenbach and Holger Stark, have really honored me. They helped me to have a visa in Germany, to be safe here, and I really respect that very much. And they understood what it meant to work with me, and in the past, having worked with WikiLeaks, they were extremely good about this. They were in constant communication. They absolutely told us what they understood, they knew, they treated us as equals. They were so respectful to us that it is, in some ways, beyond the pale. And an important, and wait a second, and I want to thank them for that, because that is, with the exception of John Getz and very few other people, they are the exception of doing that. They treated us as equals. They did not try to treat us as sources or to manipulate us. They actually cared very much about getting out the truth. They understood the political impacts. They understood the big tent. They understood the umbrella. And for that, I really think that they deserve a round of applause. So thank you, Marcel and Holger. I know that you're here. Now let's contrast that, for example, with The Guardian. The Guardian, I requested a letter from The Guardian to say that I was working on classified documents. Now, Glenn Greenwald had passed me a number of documents while working with him, specifically technical related documents, which he wanted me to help to sort of elucidate what they did and what kind of crimes the NSA was committing. And The Guardian actually directly refused to give me a letter knowing that I was in possession of classified documents. They directly refused to put myself and other people under that political tent. They simply didn't want to do it. And so, since I'm not under contractual obligation and have no loyalty to people that want to put me outside of the tent, I'd like to tell you a funny story about them. And it goes like this. When The Guardian was raided, they did not call myself or Laura Poitras here in Germany to tell us that the GCHQ and other political powers and police powers in the UK had in fact come to destroy source material. They did not tell us. We had to find out in public. They left us to hang in public. They did not treat us as equals. They did not protect us. They did not care. And they continued with this every step of the way. And while writing technical stories, they directly consulted with the White House and with GCHQ and other government officials in order to do essentially line-by-line redaction of things that were, for the most part, not actually even worth redacting. They weren't even worth compromising yourself. It reminds me of the Winston Churchill story about whether or not someone would sleep with him for $1 million. And of course, when the person says no to $1 but yes to $1 million, we know what kind of person that person is. And the same is true for The Guardian. They were willing to compromise and to give editorial control to the state. What are they then? They are stenographers. And the way, for example, they talk about Laura Poitras, who has no knowledge of me giving this talk right now, I would like to just underscore that by reading a small thing. I apologize for reading from a screen, but it's just too good just to not say it. A team of reporters and editors here at The Guardian won the Pulitzer Prize for their meticulous months-long work bringing Snowden to scale. Yet Snowden's first confidant was a filmmaker, Laura Poitras, who documented her initial contact and subsequent collaboration with Snowden in Citizen4, the third in a trilogy of feature documentaries on war and the security state. It is the weakest film of the three, despite its Oscar. Now, I don't need to go on to tell you what's going on there. Why do we tolerate this shit from these people? What arrogant British cunts. It's unbelievable. Absolutely. Now, in addition to not telling us about the raids, let's talk about another reality. David Miranda, working with The Guardian, working with Glenn Greenwald. Who do you suppose paid David Miranda's legal bills, knowing that fact? Anyone from The Guardian care to comment? Right. So in the beginning, it was potentially going to be The Guardian, but later when Glenn left, it wasn't The Guardian anymore. They left them to hang again and again. So think of this in this case in which serious journalistic freedoms are at risk, where serious people are in extreme danger under terrorism laws. And they are simply left out in the cold. And why is that? Because in capitalism, when competing, when we aren't actually cooperating together, we find in that political space the ability to get rid of our competition, literally with terrorism laws. Is that really what we want? I think what we want is a collaborative framework where we actually work well together. Now, I know what I've done here doesn't work for much more than retiring, but that's okay. And I'll leave you with another story. I suppose two stories. And one is Luke Harding. Luke Harding wrote a book about Snowden in a very exploitative, extremely negative way, and knows next to nothing about anything in the story. But an important detail is he came here to Berlin to try to pump me for information, to ask me questions about Hawaii, to ask me questions about other details. And one of the things he told me was that all of his computers were compromised to the point that his mouse was moving on his screen without him doing it. And then he dumbly asks, as if I'm not even sure if it was possible that he could really believe that he didn't know the answer to this. He said, do you suppose my computer is compromised when someone is editing the text and it removes critical parts of my story? You might want to see a doctor about that, Luke.